Assalamualaikum and good morning. Welcome to MiDAS Dialogue Serial 3, 2021. My name is Nur Aini Muhammad Nordin, Assistant Director of Maritime Security here in Malaysian Institute of Defence and Security, MiDAS. Due to the current pandemic situation here in Malaysia, we are unable to host this event physically and have to fall back on an alternative means to reach out to each and every one of you. We are going to move on to an introduction, a welcoming remark from Mr. Nur Hisham Rosli, the Acting Chief Executive of MiDAS. He is the 5th Acting Chief Executive with a long and distinguished career in defense. He has served in the Ministry of Defense as policymaker, special officer to the minister, and as the ministry think tank. Viewers will see a brief introduction and welcome from Mr. Nur Hisham.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah and good morning. A distinguished speaker, Dr. Ashraf Saleh, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the Malaysian Institute of Defence and Security MiDAS Executive Dialogue Series number 3, 2021. First and foremost, on behalf of MiDAS, wish to welcome back to Dr. Asyura. It's been more than 2 years since you have last spoken at our event. The last topic was on the holistic approach to assessing security in the Indo-Pacific. If I'm not mistaken, was back in March 2019. Hence, I would like to take this opportunity here to express our sincere appreciation and gratitude to your continuous commitment as a dialogue partner, especially in the area of maritime security. Just last week on Friday, the Klang Valley, which is the states of Selangor and Kuala Lumpur, we have finally moved toward the second phase of our country's COVID-19 recovery plan. This is a significant announcement as it gives us a bit of, I would say, some light at the end of the tunnel in the COVID situation we're in right now. However, despite having moved into the second phase, we need to stay vigilant, hence we continue to utilize the virtual platform as a means to share information and exchange of thoughts, like the one we have this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just a day shy from celebrating the Malaysia Day, which marks the formation of Malaysia. The formation of Malaysia contributes geographically to our country being a maritime nation, as underlined in the Defence White Paper. The combination of Peninsular Malaysia and the state of Sabah and Sarawak means that we have 5,749 kilometers of water border, making it our longest border in comparison to the land border, which is about 3,257 kilometers, which is challengingly long, to be honest. Yeah. Not only that, with the formation of Malaysia, we are now located between the Indian Ocean and the Asia-Pacific Ocean, with the South China Sea in between our peninsula and Sabah and Sarawak. Again, in such a geographical setting, naturally, Malaysia faces various maritime threats, both from traditional and non-traditional. Over the past months, we have seen reports of airplanes, ships, and boats encroaching into our maritime zones. The perpetrators identified reported to be both of state and non-state actors. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from that, Malaysia also borders with many countries. I think we're the one with in the region with 6 other countries, sharing border with 6 other countries: Indonesia, Cambodia, Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, Thailand, and Vietnam. Hence, international defense diplomacy is vital, as stated in the Defense White Paper. Many maritime issues are resolved through defense diplomacy, such as the Malacca Strait Patrol and the Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement. Both initiatives have proven to be successful in managing piracy, kidnapping, for ransom issues in our respective maritime zones. Therefore, we at MiDAS believe that continued discussion on maritime neo-security is a must to gain a robust understanding of the issues at hand. And today we are blessed to be in the presence of someone who is an expert in this particular field. Furthermore, today's dialogue will provide opportunity for robust discussion between our speaker and participants vis-a-vis regional maritime security amidst new security challenges. I would not want to take too long. Aini will introduce Dr. Ashraf further with everyone. And I really hope that we will have a very fruitful dialogue and, more importantly, a very robust one, where the deliberation we got from here will be used for our future references and for policymakers and practitioners to deliberate on the daily work. More importantly, on the whole security architecture of the region. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Hisham. I'm delighted, following the welcome from Chief Executive of MiDAS, to introduce our key speaker for today's dialogue, that is Dr. Ashraf Saleh, currently a Special Advisor for Maritime Security at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, a consultant for UN ODC, where she conducts research, authored reports, present findings, and moderate meetings between maritime and drug law enforcement agencies across the Asia region. At the same time, she is also the co-founder of Global Awareness and Impact Alliance, GAIA, an organization that conducts researches on emerging maritime security threats and ASEAN regional politics. She had the honor of serving an important position and notable appointments as non-resident Vasse Research Fellow at the Pacific Forum, Project Manager at the One Earth Future Foundation, SEAYLP Associate Research Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She was also a political analyst at the Prime Minister's Office and research officer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for Brunei Darussalam. Her credibility in the realm of maritime security can be seen through the numerous engagements that she has been invited, such as the Pacific Forum, Forum Asia, East-West Center, and City Talk. Furthermore, her writing has also graced numerous publications, such as Interpress News, East Asia Forum, Stable Seas, and various others. Dr. Asyura holds a Master on War Studies from the King's College London and PhD in the field of International Relations and National Security from Nanyang Technological University. Dear viewers, as each and every one of you online are aware, Malaysia and countries across the region has been affected with COVID-19 pandemic. However, at the same time, the region are still facing neo-security challenges in the maritime domain. The incident may be instigated by state actor, non-state actor, or a combination of state and non-state actors. Some of this incident has been widely reported and some aren't. And indeed, from numerical perspective, there is a need for this matter to be talked about and shared, which Dr. Asyura will be addressing this morning. Before I turn to her over, I might mention that we will be entertaining questions with respect to her presentation. That can be entered in the chat box at any time throughout her presentation. Please type in your name, your organization, followed by a question in the chat box, and we will address it during the question and answer session later. Let me turn the screen over then to Dr. Asyura to talk about regional maritime security amidst neo-security challenges.
Thank you very much, Aini. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd very much like to extend my thanks to the Malaysian Institute of Defense and Security for this very kind invitation to speak again on regional maritime security. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, hope everyone can see this. All right. So my exposure to maritime security really coincided with, I think, what Aini referred to earlier on, with this, which is this critical juncture, which we now know as the COVID-19 pandemic. So much so that now as we move forward, we're really beginning to see the world in two different eras. We've got the pre-pandemic and also the post-pandemic state. We saw in the past 2 years, actually, how the pandemic has actually created this drastic shift in our operational landscape. Clearly enough, we saw that the security environment as well was no less impacted by the sudden onslaught of this virus. And so today, I really thought to share my personal thoughts on how maritime security in our beloved region of Southeast Asia have actually impacted by what I now term as the pandemic effect. I'll be talking about maritime security by really condensing it at its most basic sense, which is as the need to want to preserve the sea as this provider of undersea resources and as a transport hub that will be able to sustain the coastal communities in this region and also the economic progress and development of maritime states in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, of course, included. I think in the past 2 years, we really saw how this pandemic had first and foremost really threatened our basic human needs. But across the months, I then saw an observation where really this draws similar parallels to maritime security, where if we do not provide the same level of proper care and approaches to preserve our environment for the long term, we would also quite clearly experience a similar threat to our basic human needs. So today I thought to actually frame my very brief observations through the lens of the pandemic effect. I'll really begin by first providing an overview of how the pandemic effect exacerbated existing fissures within a few maritime security threats. I will only be addressing 3 because clearly there are a lot more maritime security themes that we should address, which I hope we can then pick up later on in the discussion. I thought that we can then also look into how the region has really responded to this pandemic effect. How has it balanced the imperative of responding to this wave of infections within its borders, while also protecting the maritime waterways that it has around it? I thought we can then really end this discussion by really looking into what the new norm is for regional maritime security. Will we be seeing new mechanisms, or will the region be too intransigent to adopt new modes of coordination? So really, when talking about the pandemic effect, I thought to first and foremost address illegal anchoring, because it really does show how a particular maritime security threat that is not too frequent has actually emerged and escalated under this new environment. You can see through this example that the pandemic effect is actually quite evident in almost every non-traditional security challenge we see at sea. In Malaysia's waters, particularly in waters east of Johor, we've seen an increase in illegal anchoring activities. I don't really have firm numbers, but we are looking at around 90 vessels being seized in January this year, and another 72 vessels seized in March. When most of these vessels are boarded, they are mostly foreign flagged, and most of them do not have documents indicating that they have this permit to anchor in Malaysia's territorial waters. And so the unregulated presence of these vessels have raised a few concerns. These concerns are linked to environmental damage, where these vessels may be responsible for maybe illegally dumping oil at sea, or they may have this unreported relationship to other transnational crimes, which are actually quite difficult to detect. But if we were to look into illegal anchoring quite closely, we're able to see that many of these activities are actually not very ill intent. Often mariners have mistakenly understood when they are anchoring within Malaysian territorial waters. But in a more COVID-related explanation, most of these vessels are waiting to enter ports that now have to abide by new operating procedures that have been imposed by the shipping industry in order to try reduce congestion at port, so as to not encourage the spread of COVID-19. But nevertheless, what this has done is that it has actually resulted in unregulated and even illegal movement in other regional waters, including Malaysian territorial waters. And this has produced broad repercussions. Having large numbers of these illegal anchored vessels could actually produce congestion issues for other more legitimate operators at sea. And even when these vessels are charged under the Merchant Shipping Ordinance Act, Getting a vessel released takes a few days or it takes a few weeks, and it can cost up to around 24,000 US dollars. Sure, this may be an additional cost, but more importantly, it can delay shipping time. But whether or not this does prove enough of a deterrence is quite questionable, because Johor is strategically located near the Singapore Strait, and it does continue to offer deep waters, which is an attractive anchoring point for merchant vessels and passenger ferries. Another issue which I really wanted to link to the pandemic effect is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. IUU fishing was previously known for its popularity, recently known more like for its popularity as a gray zone tactic. But I think that we should actually shift our lens onto IUU fishing and look into the more direct implications it has to both food and also socioeconomic stability. Every year, we're seeing around 26 million tons of fish being caught illegally across the world. And this really makes up for around 10 to 20% of global fish catch, which is actually quite significant. It also translates into broad economic losses. You know, for a small country like Brunei, this leads to around a loss of around 40 million Malaysian ringgit a year, but Malaysia is experiencing 6 billion RM in terms of economic loss. Additionally, only 50% of fish caught from national waters within Malaysia actually go back into the local market. And so critical action needs to be taken to prevent the smuggling of fish products out of the local market across the region. And so when the pandemic first came in early last year, a lot of us thought that, you know, it would play a role in actually halting IUU fishing, especially as we've got travel restrictions being imposed and vessels are often restrained from venturing out to sea under these new lockdown measures. But as we saw quite quickly a few months into the pandemic, this was really not the case. In the Philippines, around the period when lockdown measures were instituted, I think in February last year, the Karagatan Patrol, which is an NGO that uses satellite imagery, observed around 3,600 vessels in the Philippines' municipal waters. The lockdown was then instituted by Manila, and the month after, in March, this number escalated to around 6,000 vessels. You know, whether or not these vessels are foreign, whether or not they're local, if they're commercial or artisanal, you know, remains to be seen. But they do point to the persistent fishing vessels that continue to operate even under the pandemic period, especially in marine protected areas. This includes the Palawan waters and also the Tikau-Burias Pass just off Sabah, actually. And sure, it's quite easy to, excuse me, to point our finger at the pandemic effect as the sole driver of this escalation in IUU fishing, but yet other drivers are also responsible. We've got weak regulatory regimes across the region. Current legislation is simply not stringent enough. Having said this, it actually is quite refreshing to read that Malaysia had actually recently amended its Fisheries Act to increase the general penalty of offenses. But yet we've got other violations, right, that fall under the IUU fishing umbrella. This includes the unreported fishing of protected species or the use of illegal fishing equipment, and control around these regulations have yet to be better implemented across the entire region. But yet coastal communities and fishermen continue to practice illegal fishing practices because of drivers that are more rooted in land and based around their livelihood. This can be found in growing numbers of unemployment, where people are losing jobs in their cities due to the pandemic and then moving further down towards the coast, thereby participating in illegal fishing practices. We're also finding unequal levels of distribution of resources, which are contributing to IUU fishing, low levels of education, and also the insufficient capacity to implement regulation. The third transnational threat that I thought we could address is maritime drug trafficking. And it's really quite interesting to see here how COVID-19 yet again has drastically altered the way drug traffickers and enforcement agencies operate within the region. At the start of last year, around February or March, we saw this drop in maritime drug trafficking when COVID first arrived in our region, primarily because traffickers were now they were now really constrained as overland trafficking routes were shut down. But it didn't take long for these trafficking operations to rebound, and drug flows continued once again at quite a normal rate. In fact, a record level was achieved last year in which over 169 tons of methamphetamine or shabu was seized across the region. And clearly, as we will see, this trend will continue rising. I guess the more important question to ask is, okay, how has COVID-19 impacted the operational landscape of both traffickers and enforcement agencies? In terms of transportation routes, we've seen that almost overnight, both air and land borders were shut down. International borders were shut down, and this had affected air and flight routes as well. Normal overland trafficking routes were closely monitored as we had more police checks taking place, more roadblocks, more cars were being inspected for cargo, and so on. And this inevitably impacted the normal land routes that were being used to transfer methamphetamine. And quite interestingly, what this has then led to is a shift into further out to sea into other maritime trafficking routes, where the Andaman Sea, as we see here, was once used to just carry spillover of methamphetamine that did not move along overland trafficking routes. What we're now seeing is the Andaman Sea is transforming into a major trafficking route because all the land routes are being shut down. I think it's important to also look into how COVID has affected societal interaction. The ILO and the ADB, the International Labour Organization, and the Asian Development Bank warned that last year, around 10 to 15 million young people between the age of 15 to 24 all lost their jobs. And so this meant that many of them were trapped at home with nothing to do, without employment, and they are therefore more likely to be linked to deviant behavior, including a rise in illicit substance use, which quite naturally would increase the demand for methamphetamine and other drugs. In terms of enforcement, quite interestingly, actually, COVID-19 produced an opposite effect. It posed the threat of unmonitored movement of people within and across countries. And so both external and domestic enforcement levels have actually heightened. Within borders, we're seeing the police, we're seeing the military, all being deployed to enforce health protocols. And enforcement has also stepped up along maritime and land borders in order to prevent this inflow of unmonitored infections. But yet again, what this has done is that it has pushed trafficking operations further out to sea. We're seeing new old routes being used more efficiently, and also new modus operandi cropping up. The Straits of Malacca, and especially the northern bit of Aceh, is receiving a lot more shipment of consignments of meth packages. And the Gulf of Thailand is also observing a lot more transfers of meth. There are also interesting ways that drug traffickers are coming up with under the pandemic environment. This includes transshipment at sea, where rendezvous points are now further out into the international waters, where two boats then meet and then they transfer the drugs and return back to coast. There's also the pick and drop method, where vessels would carry their consignment, drop it out at sea, and then share the coordinates with the buyers, or maybe even floating packages, which we're seeing a lot more in the Gulf of Thailand, where meth really is just floating and hanging out at sea, waiting to be picked up. And so the question really is then, if COVID-19 has impacted our maritime security landscapes, we're seeing them heighten these maritime security threats. The question then is, how has it impacted our operational response? At the start of the pandemic, I think COVID-19 was a huge shock to the entire region. Regional countries were all preoccupied with battling infections within their borders. And so this resulted in redirecting more resources towards containing the spread of COVID-19. Unfortunately, this also corresponded with budget cuts to other state functions, including defense. We saw how Indonesia's defense budget last year lowered by 7%, and Thailand's budget lowered by around 8%. For Thailand, this resulted in the delay of the purchase of 2 submarines, as the submarine procurement funding was slashed to 0 last year. But a few months later, our naval and Coast Guard sectors all rebounded very quickly, while still maintaining an emphasis on curtailing the undetected spread of COVID-19. Maritime enforcement patrols have significantly stepped up. We've got Ops Benteng, which took place in Malaysia and still is. I think it'd be really great to hear the experience of our audience in this. And also we're seeing regional dialogues and high-level meetings on maritime security issues quickly shifting to virtual platforms, although it did take us a couple of months to try to figure out how to work out Zoom and also WebEx. Relationships with counterparts and also trust building also continued through WhatsApp, and slowly and surely procurement soon commenced. I think Malaysia procured more littoral mission ships. Brunei acquired new drones to conduct surveillance and reconnaissance over their maritime border. And also the Philippines acquired new fast attack interdiction crafts. Regional exercises also commenced. I think the 20th CCAT was held last month, and this combined SOP compliant field exercises with a week of virtual seminars. But quite interestingly, I think the region was able to be quite flexible in its response because it had actually built on existing relationships that were there before the pandemic. Unlike other regions, I think Southeast Asia prides itself on building a foundation of trust with its counterparts at a very informal level. And what this has done is that it has established personal relationships through what we now term as WhatsApp diplomacy. And this allows for the immediate notification of events that occur across the region on an urgent basis, and also for the sharing of other types of information. We're also seeing this outcrop of information sharing centers like the Information Fusion Center in Singapore. And yes, this does provide a platform to collate and process information and then distribute it across the region. But it also helps build long-term relationships between the international liaison officers, which continue to carry on during the pandemic. So I think the past 2 years, I think it has really shown us, the gravity at which a public health crisis can have significant repercussions on national security and also events at sea. Non-traditional maritime security threats, some of which I've addressed here, but as you can see, is a very small drop in the ocean as compared to the scale of threats taking place now. These threats have actually been exacerbated and have in fact become more deadly to an extent under the pandemic effect. But the pandemic has also called for this readjustment in our approach towards preserving maritime security. Yet we have to reconcile with the fact that modes of virtual engagement and shifts at work can only continue on for so long. There needs to be a more holistic reassessment in the strategies that we use to ensure that we can weather another global public health crisis. So what can we do in moving forward? I feel that there are several elements that we need to try and incorporate into our maritime security strategies. The first is that the region needs to move genuinely towards broader stakeholder engagement. We've got initiatives in Indonesia called the Ikan Project. And this project seeks to engage multi-stakeholders in an effort to really curtail IUU fishing. But not much is heard from this initiative ever since. And so we are unable to really determine how this initiative worked out and if we can also use it across the region. Having a multi-stakeholder initiative does show, however, that the government, the shipping industry, authorities, civil society organizations like NGOs, and even representatives of coastal communities all need to be present at the table to ensure that threats can be jointly countered with targeted and effective approaches. Some of these approaches could include coastal community policing efforts or the training of coastal community leaders in teaching them to better monitor fishing activities to ensure that they are compliant with regulations. In addition to broad engagement, I think it's extremely important to maintain eyes at sea 24/7, especially as agencies are trapped on land and are unable to be deployed out to sea. This can be done through significant investment in maritime domain awareness technology and also information sharing initiatives. I understand Malaysia has a nationwide system that helps collect real-time data. And this is extremely useful, once again, if officers are unable to be out at sea. But to complement a nationwide data collection system such as this, more incentives need to be given to fishing vessels as well to encourage them to purchase and operate AIS systems, or automated identification systems, to help track irregular behavior. But collating and maintaining a national MDA system can only bring us so far. I mean, what do we do if we need to anticipate a threat such as suspicious vessels entering national waters from other jurisdictions? more coordination needs to take place across the region through real-time information sharing systems. Currently, most news, as we saw, is being shared on an informal basis, but this can be upgraded through more bilateral or multilateral mechanisms that will be enabled to have a fluid flow of information and alerts that have operational value to all our stakeholders, our authorities, our prosecutors, and even coastal communities. We can get into another discussion on what type of structures of information sharing are effective, what are the different goals of these information sharing structures, are they only focused on confidence building, diplomatic engagement, or genuine operational information exchange? I would definitely look forward to your thoughts later on. And so as demonstrated, I think we all already have the tools that we need at our disposal to achieve sustainable maritime security. All that is needed is more shared awareness on how the pandemic effect has impacted not just one country, but the entire region by virtue of escalating and aggravating threats that are present in our shared maritime domain. I think that the region has responded very flexibly to these threats so far, but more definitely needs to be done to readjust our approach towards maritime security. We need to strengthen our engagement with one another to cultivate more commitment from across all stakeholders in order to better fluidly share information. I think by doing this, we can together reap the benefits of our shared maritime commons. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I do look forward to your questions and thoughts. I've left here my email address and also the QR code at the bottom. This is for a little NGO that we set up in Brunei called Gaia. Feel free to use it to reach out to me for any reason. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much. Over to you, Aini.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura. The presentation just now has been truly an eye-opening. We have seen how the effects of new security, such as the pandemic that we're facing right now, has on illegal anchoring, the escalation of illegal and unreported, as well as unregulated fishing, drug trafficking, the way it changes their routes during this COVID pandemic, as well as the flexibility in response by which we, as a member of the region, should be proud of, especially due to our strong foundation in terms of friendship among nations in Southeast Asia. We have a question here, Dr. Asyura, from Munira Alatas from UKM. There has been a lengthy problem of maritime enforcement and implementation of regulation in our regional waters, now reinforced by the pandemic effect. There's two questions here. Please comment on where ASEAN has failed. The second is how leadership features such as corruption, etc., in individual countries contribute to the problem.
Thank you very much, Aini. And I hope the presentation was once again very helpful to the audience. I think that this question posed on the utility of ASEAN really built from my one of my final points on really the role of information sharing structures and just coordination mechanisms as a whole across the region. ASEAN is a multilateral platform, and so it prides itself on being able to enhance regional unity, to build consensus, and also really provide a platform for developing greater diplomatic ties. But once again, ASEAN comprises of both maritime and also land-based countries within the entire region. There are 10 of us, but only a handful of maritime states. And so when it comes to actually building consensus and generating the willingness to want to actually dedicate resources towards certain maritime confidence building initiatives, it would be quite hard to do so. I don't think ASEAN has failed because it was not really established to provide a platform for operational, joint operational coordination. As we saw earlier, I think mentioned at the start in the opening remarks that there are other mechanisms that we can resort to. We've got minilateral mechanisms which are more effective in generating operational initiatives, primarily because they're able to develop this common level of shared threat awareness between only maritime states We saw it. We saw the Malacca Straits Patrol between Malaysia and Indonesia, and Singapore and Thailand. We also see the Trilateral Cooperative Arrangement, Sulu and South Seas. And so I think ASEAN's role really is in actually building more confidence and establishing that foundation of trust that we spoke about at the start, in order to then give these countries the strength and the confidence they need to move their efforts to a more operational level through unilateral solutions and whatnot. Because of that, we do have the ASEAN Maritime Forum, which is more of an information exchange platform. We've got ASEAN HAKGAM as well to really strengthen relationships with our counterparts. So I think it's quite important to look into this distinction in structure between multilateral and unilateral mechanisms and where the role of ASEAN falls within this. I think in terms of leadership fissures, such as corruption, I think that all in all, this really boils down to the problem of what we look at when we identify key stakeholders in managing maritime security issues. When we look into, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the ICAN project initiated by Indonesia, by giving more voice and more role to coastal communities or civil society organizations, for example, I think then we are then able to hold them accountable for actually addressing maritime security threats. And so when we do come across certain leadership fissures, these would not inherently impact the work that we're doing in addressing maritime security. This once again yet points to the need to broaden stakeholder engagement, which I alluded to earlier on. Over to you, Aini.
Thank you for your thoughts just now, Dr. Asyura. Following up, I do have an additional question, following up from the question about ASEAN. As we know that within the ASEAN, we have sectorals. And so when we talk about IUU, we talk about drug trafficking. It's different from the ADMM. It falls under different sectoral, so to speak. What are your thoughts on this? In Asia, we see across sectoral meetings and engagement as well as cooperation. But what are your thoughts about when it comes to maritime security? Should we have such working group sectoral engagement? I'll pass it to you, Dr. Asyura.
Thank you, Aini. Yes, certainly. I wouldn't deter anyone from not highlighting a certain issue as a concern and initiating dialogue on that. I definitely think that there should be sectoral initiatives on these issues, but rather I also feel that this should be complemented with this narrative to want to also look at IUU fishing, drug trafficking, and I think I mentioned illegal anchoring as real security concerns as well. For us to do this, we need to as you call it, it's called agenda setting, where we need to highlight the direct repercussions that these issues have to national security, to the leaders and the highest senior leaders that operate in ASEAN. So then we'd be able to escalate it to a more regional level discussion. And then this would then quite fluidly fall into other dialogues, including the ADMM perhaps, but we're not doing enough of that. We see IUU fishing as perhaps an environmental concern only, as perhaps something that would not have a direct implication on national security, when in fact it clearly does, as we're seeing recently in the events taking place in Natuna, for example. Over to you, Aini. Oh, I don't think I hear you. No. Sorry, Aini, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, right. Okay, so we have a second question from Engineer Shan Sulaiman of SSM Associates. Generally, the Malaysian public are not aware of maritime security issues. Mostly people hear news on China Coast Guard ships. How would the public be made aware effectively?
I think this is a great question because usually when we look at maritime security issues, we think it's a policy issue or an enforcement issue, when actually what we need to generate, especially in our engagement, is actually more policy relevant knowledge that is applicable to not just our enforcement authorities, but also the public, because they are as responsible when it comes to conducting their illegal fishing practices, for example. So, for example, what we do here in Gaia is that we try to take our observations on security issues and we condense it to the public. Actually, end of this week, we are releasing a policy paper on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in Borneo. And this is also complemented with an art auction where we get local artists in to share their art pieces of the sea and how it's endangering wildlife. I think this is very important in really cultivating this recognition of a cause across all layers of our stakeholders. And so in such a sense and through such a broad and approachable method, we're able to engage all stakeholders on a single table. So really it's a matter of just trying to condense our policy and security analysis, the operations that we have, and always making it open to our public through various means that we have, be it through auctions, be it through radio interviews, or be it through attractive infographics on Instagram. Over to you, Aini.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf, for your suggestion just now. I'm just wondering, when we talk about maritime security, obviously you mentioned earlier that there are certain parties that utilize maritime security, non-traditional, so-called non-traditional threat concerns, or issues in this case, that also affect national security, as you mentioned. What are your thoughts on, what type of steps or strategy do you think countries should take in these situations?
Thanks for that question. I think that when we look at the role of non-state actors, it really does put some authorities in a very difficult issue, especially when it comes to needing to apprehend them or take them through the court process. But I feel another issue is also in being able to identify and track their movements and behavior. Very basic example we can use is the movement of migrants, for example, across the Sulu archipelago from the Philippines and into Sabah. I think what we could do and need to do actually is to enhance regional coordination and information sharing yet once again. Information on the movement of people and having intelligence officers being posted at certain coastal communities to share information, not just with their national defense authorities, but also across the board with other countries that share that particular sea. So I think that the key in actually countering non-state actors is actually first in information sharing. That needs to be fluid. Once we are able to get that down to pat, only then can we move towards more effective operational coordination.
We have a question coming from Commander Ashraf of MiDAS. You have mentioned that 6 billion was lost in IUU fishing. How was this calculation was made? Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually got it from a news piece, which I can share with you if you'd like on this chat platform. That statistic also came with my earlier statistic stating that 50% of the fish that are being exploited in territorial waters only feed the local market in Malaysia. If you're able to provide me another figure that is more updated, that would be extremely highly appreciated and would give us a better understanding of the environment. I'll share it with you now.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura. We don't see any more questions coming in. If there is any more, we'll give it a minute or two for the audience or viewers to type in your question in the chat box, because we have a few, about 15 minutes more till the end of the session, a dialogue for today. Should you have any question, please type it in the chat box and we'll pick it up and give it to Dr. Asyura. Well, in the meantime, I do have a question. Just now you mentioned about, I'm going for IUU, focusing right now. 40 billion was lost by Brunei. I mean, we've seen a lot of sub-regional cooperation or engagement arrangement made. But we've not heard on Brunei, how are they tackling this issue? Thank you.
A good question. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of engagement, especially in the Sulawesi Seas. Seeing a lot of joint marine protected areas being managed between Malaysia and the Philippines. We're also seeing CEFTEC based out in Manila doing a lot of critical research on what's happening out in the Sulu Sea. Brunei has a relatively smaller coastline as compared to its other neighbors on Borneo. And so at the same time, it has a limited assets in actually being able to monitor its maritime backyard. The fisheries department plays a huge role in actually trying to patrol Brunei's fishing zones, but quite ultimately, a lot of their assets depend on the patrols the vessels that can be extended by the Royal Brunei Navy. Brunei is not alone in this issue of restrained resources and capacity. In fact, other states across Borneo are in the same boat. And so, which is why we actually advocate for more recognition of the fact that Borneo shares a single coastline and shares all these waters. And so if we're able to pool our resources, our know-how, our knowledge through broader island-wide coordination, I think we'd all be able to do a better job in protecting our waters in Borneo.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf, for your answer just now. We're not saying any more questions. I suppose that a lot of our viewers are a bit shy on giving out questions to you today. Again, thank you so very, very much for the wonderfully articulate and comprehensive talk, Dr. Asyura. Thank you again, Doctor, for taking part in our MiDAS Dialogue Serial 3 2021. Let me draw the attention of viewers to this online dialogue that a video of this dialogue will be available on YouTube. Please search MiDAS Malaysia via Google search engine. Last but not least, before we leave, I would like to request cooperation from the audience to open your video or start your video so that we could have a group photo. Before we leave, Dr. Asyura already posted in the chat box her email address. All the viewers or participants who wishes to ask further question to her. I see a few questions coming in right after we ended the session, Q&A session just now. You can post it directly to Dr. Asyura via email later. I'm sure she'll be very pleased to answer the questions. All right. So last but not least, thank you to all participants for joining and staying with us today. Please provide your feedback on today's event that will pop up as you leave this webinar. Have a great day ahead till we meet again in our next dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.